it's just ha mi ho talacha feikin enoch. So nice to see you. It's been a while. It's been about, I guess, a year since we gathered for Gaelic. So we see some familiar faces and some new faces too. So welcome to everybody. I'm my name's Misha MacEachen. I guess sauna shutikveka hami enoch. So my name is Frances MacEachen, and I'm here in Little Judik, and I'm happy to co-host tonight with Mike Kennedy. So we're going to have another 7 weeks of Ed Haley Friday night. So I hope you can join us every week. And so before we get into it, though, I want to acknowledge that that most of us on the call, or many of us, not all of us for sure, but we are here in the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And it's important to know that the Mi'kmaq did not give up their territory when they, for the peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown. So, but we came as Gaels, our ancestors came over here, and after leaving their own land where they, experienced their own colonial oppression, they were able to come here, get land, and were able to live in community, and the language and culture continued to the present day. So it's quite a privilege, but it was a privilege that came at a great cost to the Mi'kmaq. So at this time of truth and reconciliation, like we hope we have the courage to face our history, and we hope for healing here in Mi'kmaq. So Palcharavula. And some of you, a lot of you will be familiar with Ed Haley. And what we try to do every week is create this convivial and welcoming space where we share stories about our connection with Gaelic language and culture and community. And we check in with the stories that may no longer serve us, and the ones that we want more of in our lives. And this year, for this season, we picked a theme, Why Gaelic Matters. And our team, and we have two new people on the team, I should mention, Shannon McMullen and Kieran Walker. And Shannon is already put to work on tech tonight. So her and Susan are working on tech. But they'll do their own presentations over the next 7 weeks. And now, are you hearing me? I see this sign, your connection, your internet is not stable. So my connection, there might be a little bit of a lag. So bear with me. I'm almost finished. But I wanted to mention about our theme, Why Gaelic Matters. And anybody who's involved with Gaelic and Gaelic culture, and when we use that word Gaelic, I should say we're talking about what we call the big tent of Gaelic. So it's culture, music, song, traditions, and so we are using that as so what we connect to in Gaelic, with the language, of course, at the center, but there's so much more to it as well. So that's what we're talking about in this series. And as anybody's involved in Gaelic language or any language and cultural revival know, it's a lot of hard work. So we have to check in with ourselves and say, remind us why this is important work, why it matters, and why we do it. So also another reminder, if you want to go, tonight we have breakout rooms, as our custom is at the very beginning, we go into breakout rooms. And if you want to go in a Gaelic breakout room, and I see that many people have put that G in front of their names, if you want to go in a Gaelic breakout room, make sure you rename yourself with a G at the beginning so Shannon can group you. Group all the people that want to go in the Gaelic speaking room. And this takes a little bit of time. We have 80 people on the call. So, so hopefully we'll be able to do that. So we'll just, hopefully, how's it going, Shannon? Are you able to get them? Is it working for you? Cool. Yeah. So make sure you put the G in front of your name. Okay, great. So yeah, we're going to go into a breakout room, as is the custom. And at the Cayley, you want to go and greet each other first and say hello. And then we have a question that we'll put in the chat as well that'll follow you in the room. And so when we go in, they'll be in groups of threes. And what we'd like people to do is to we're going to give you 3 minutes each to introduce yourselves and then answer the question. And would like everybody to take their time and to take their turn. So when one person is speaking, the other two people just have to listen. And that way we get to hear from everybody, and everybody gets to share. And so, yeah, don't worry if you're thinking and there's a pause, that's perfectly fine, no problem. Like dead air is okay. We're just want to be sure everybody has a chance to share. And if you happen to land in a group of 2 or 4, then you might want to adjust the times. So you might have 4 minutes or 2 minutes. And we will give you reminders. They'll pop on the screen when the first person speaks, and the second person, and the third person, so on. So yeah, so open your chat box when you get in, and you'll see the question. And it's just one question. You have to think about what part of Gaelic is important to you, and how does it show up in your life? So again, this is the broad meaning of Gaelic. So Shannon is going to whiz us away into Gaelic rooms, and we'll see you back. And Mike Kennedy will welcome you back after 10 minutes or so.
You want to be on TV if you can come.
Looks like people are.
This meeting is being recorded.
So it looks like everybody is more or less back here. So welcome back, folks. Before we get started here, we talked in our group about potentially each session we might do something like share a little proverb. So I was thinking about Michael and what we're going to chat about tonight, and had quite a few really, I thought, appropriate ones, but I'm going to go with this one. So it's An fair na chur a chuch an cunarst, ha jane cowl no bunyak. The one who will not take a risk will not lose, nor will they win. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome Michael Newton, Dr. Michael Newton, to our session tonight. Michael and I have known each other for about 30 years now, been friends for about 30 years. And although we are typically never in the same part of the world, I did manage to have a nice visit with him this summer, and also get a nice catch up with him. So I first met Michael, I guess when we were at Edinburgh, and he was just starting out on his PhD journey at that time. Since then, I left academia behind me and went to work as an emergency response planner. But Michael persevered and stuck on the academic road as a researcher and a lecturer and teacher. And his accomplishments have been quite extraordinary. He's published numerous books, so some quite interesting and humorous and light, like this. I'm sorry, it looks like it's backwards there, but it's the naughty little book of Gaelic, everything you need to know about cursing and so on in the Gaelic world, to award-winning books like Shanachí na Caille, The Memory Keepers of the Forest, looking at the poetic tradition in Canada. As you can see, when he gets to work, he does it very thoroughly. What makes it even more extraordinary to me is that Michael's done a lot of this work. He's published numerous books and countless articles, papers in journals and conferences, lectured widely and so on, and been a consultant. But he's done a lot of this, perhaps even most of it, without the benefit of any really significant financial support. So he's not been doing this as a professional in many cases. It's just his interest. And he's made it his mission to make as much Gaelic history and literature and folklore available to the general public as he possibly can, which is something I greatly admire him for. So there's so much more I could say about Michael, but you've probably seen his biography in the lead up to the course, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the journey he's taken. So I think instead of me talking about him, We're going to get going with Michael and talk to him about the journey. Let him tell us the story. So great to have you here, Michael. Falche Orst.
Yeah, it's great to be amongst friends, and I see many familiar faces, some of whom I've known for a few years, and a few like Mike I've known for decades. So it is kind of stunning, to see the time pass, and to have that kind of perspective, and to kind of have chances to sort of ruminate on these things and what they mean and where they came from. I suppose I could just start out with a bit about my background. And
well, Michael, if you're sorry, I'm sorry, I got a little trouble here with my the way my screen is showing up. But I think what we'll do, if you're ready to go, yeah. Okay, so why don't we dive in with that? We'll get into what's happened here. So I think what we'll do is I'm just thinking about you and I've talked over the years. So the way I'm thinking about this, like sometime in the 1980s, roughly. Michael Newton has the world by the tail. He's young, handsome, bright, energetic, lives in a beautiful climate, sunny, warm all year round, and he's about to embark on a career that's potentially quite lucrative as a software developer. Take us to that time and tell us the rest of the story. How did Gaelic come to be important to you?
Okay, yeah, maybe I can retrospectively go backward a little bit later, but kind of at the forking point, I suppose. I was in college. I was finishing a bachelor's degree, and I had an interest in Celtic matters. I was a big fan of what people were calling Celtic music, and I was putting myself through college by writing computer games, actually. So I was doing that part-time while I did a degree. So I knew it was a secure path, because at that point, the computer field was still fairly young. And I was an accomplished software developer at that point. And after I finished my degree, I decided I really liked academia. Like, I wanted to be in an academic environment, and nobody in my family had ever been to college before. I had no guidance. And in fact, after high school, I worked for 2 years before I went to college, because, I didn't know any better. I didn't know what to do. So, but once I was in college, I really enjoyed, taking courses and continuing to learn. So I kind of by default, I started a PhD, or I signed up for a PhD. I was planning on doing that after I finished my bachelor's degree. But because I had such a great interest in Celtic things, and I'd never been to Europe before, I decided I'd go on a trip around, Scotland and Ireland and Wales and Brittany. And so I did that, and I was just completely, now it wasn't something that I just heard on the radio and saw in books. It was something that was, a living landscape, real people, and it had kind of a tangible material reality that it didn't have for me before. It was just much more conceptual before. So I went back to this other university and started the PhD, and I had brought back some books with me from my trip, so I actually would have better sources, because even though when I was in college I had an interest in these things, there were no courses available. I would have, so I did my bachelor's degree at University of California in San Diego, which is an enormous university. Can't remember how many thousands of students are there, but there was nothing at all on offer that I could have taken. So this was just something I was doing on my own, and my girlfriend at the time also had an interest. So I brought back books with me, and I was supposed to, of course, been reading up on all of these computer topics for my PhD, but I had a very hard time focusing on that, because I was just so obsessed, with this, history, culture, music, and everything from Scotland and Ireland and Wales and Brittany. And especially, I do have some Irish and Scottish background in terms of my ancestry, and I was particularly taken by Ireland. And I was trying to think, how could I get back there and do this again? Because I realized I wasn't gonna, the older I got, the harder it would be to have opportunities like that to travel. And after that first year was over, I decided I wanted to go somehow try to live in Scotland or Ireland. But I didn't, I was doing this PhD and I found a way to do that. And I had to sort of put the PhD on hold. And what I did was I at that time, now this is before the Celtic Tiger, there were really no jobs in Ireland. That was kind of what I was aiming for. I wanted to find a way to live in Ireland, but there was really, the economy was so poor. I couldn't, but there was a job in Glasgow doing computer work in the computer department. So I decided what I would do is I would work in the department on this research project. And while I did that, I would try to take the courses that I never had the chance to take before. And, in terms of my interests, so this is the early 90s. And I was already, very interested in music and dance, kind of the creative arts. And I also had a great interest in human ecology because, it was pretty obvious to me in the 80s, or even before that, when I was a child, that there was a serious environmental challenge that the world had. And I wanted to know kind of how do different traditions, how do different cultures, how do different societies, what is their relationship, to the environment? So I had kind of a whole set of questions, a whole set of, issues that I was interested in. And regardless of what that was, whether it was, literature is also, a very big literature person. When I started my bachelor's degree, I kind of fancied the idea of being a writer, and I actually entered UCSD as an English major, but I knew it wasn't practical because, being from a poor family, I had no idea how I could actually make that work. So I knew I had to sort of change to computer science, but I at least fancied myself, being a literary person, and tried to, as much as possible, to hang out at the coffee shop and not dress like a computer geek. So try to pass myself off with the arts crowd. So when I went to Scotland, again, I immersed myself as much as possible, and was just really, I don't know, just really drawn to all of these things. And I knew that I needed to learn Gaelic. And in fact, the first year that I started my PhD, which I didn't finish, in computer science, in Pittsburgh, I met people there's a pretty active Irish community there, and I started learning Irish in Pittsburgh. So I knew that was kind of the key that I had to, grasp. And I, immediately started listening to Radio na Gael, and that was a great way of just kind of getting the sound of the language in my ears. And I got a room as a lodger with a woman who was from Skye. She was the same age as my grandmother. She was a really, really kind woman. And so she was, very patient with me as I had very, very primitive Gaelic at that point. And her name was Flora. And she was, very generous in allowing me to try to have conversations, even though my Gaelic really was not very good, but she was very, very kind. And that was kind of how I did my starting to immerse myself. And, people assume you have to go to the Western Isles or something to get Gaelic, but I spoke Gaelic every day, in Glasgow, because my landlady spoke Gaelic. I found people in the shops along Byres Road who were Gaelic speakers. And I was taking classes in the Celtic department there, including Gaelic. And I even, was foolish enough, for example, to see this guy that I knew was a Gaelic speaker and sat with him at lunch. And I later realized that was Derek Thompson. And I can't believe I was wasting his time with my primitive Gaelic, but he was very patient and very, long suffering with me. So that's kind of how I started. I felt like this was this amazing kind of huge universe of things, and that I was just really drawn to, and I couldn't put it down. I couldn't let go of it. It was just something that I knew that I had a chance, that I wouldn't have that chance again.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And so that's a pull. You've got you start to kind of see something around the culture, and it's catching your attention. But what would make you give up this idyllic lifestyle, supposedly, and decide, hey, I'm going to Scotland, I'm going to give up this PhD, I'm going to give up my computer software work for the moment? And was there anything in your life that was kind of not feeling 100% where you wanted to be at that stage?
Well, I guess one thing I'll say is that I've always been an idealist and an altruistic person, and I was not, I didn't have a plan, and maybe that is, a really big failing on my part. Maybe I should have said, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to make this work financially. I just knew that, like, there was the very popular saying, follow your bliss. And I just found myself really blissed out by learning about the music and listening to the music and going to dances and meeting people. Flora, as I said, this very nice Banskia noch, same age as my grandmother. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother growing up, more time than my parents quite often. So I was very comfortable with, intergenerational interaction. But also, growing up, I grew up in the desert in a very unnatural environment, a very human-made environment. And, again, kind of the question about the relationship between people and the environment was something I was really aware of from an early age. And I was the oldest in my generation. So I've got 3 younger siblings, and then I've got, several cousins, and they're all younger than I am. And I kind of felt like there was, seeing them growing up and seeing kind of the values that people had, it was all very artificial. It was all about what you bought and how you defined your identity from the things that you owned. And I just found it really, really shallow. I just felt like there was something really superficial and missing in the way that people kind of created these identities. And, and again, this is in Southeast California, so it's a desert, it's very remote, but the big lights that kind of were the guiding lights of people were coming from places like LA and Disneyland. And, I don't want to put down anybody's pastimes or the way that they define themselves, but I found for myself that defining yourself from Hollywood and from commercial consumerism is a really shallow way to create a culture. And that was kind of gobbling everything up at the time, seeing that kind of consumerism defining people's sense of identity and relationships, being mediated by these corporate interests. So kind of from an early age, I was very critical. I had this kind of social critique going on, and that obviously has an impact on the environment, because if you define your life and your identity by the stuff you own rather than something that has more depth or something that's more intangible and something that has something to do with other values, then that there's an environmental cost for that. So I was very aware of that. Right. And so that's those were some of the questions that were on my mind when I saw Gaelic, and I thought, this is a culture that's been around for a very long time, and that's not based on defining itself from Hollywood and these other kind of more modern and consumer-oriented, corporate-oriented values.
So you went over to Scotland, you're kind of exploring that, and you say it really, you felt this sense of bliss. So you hit a crossroads. You could either go back to that lifestyle as kind of an easy path, easy for you probably to do very well there, or you could go down the Gaelic path, and you chose the Gaelic path. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind taking us down that path a little bit with you, your time in Scotland. What did you actually do? Who did you meet? What did you see? What really brought you to life during that period after making that decision that this is where I'm going?
Well, another thing to mention is that nowadays there's a whole kind of social movement around the idea of social justice, and I didn't have that term at the time, but the idea of social justice was very much another aspect that I felt was really important, that drew me. That what happens to people when you take away their language and their culture, and they don't have any kind of cultural sovereignty. So I was very aware of that, both in terms of the history of North America and and this being kind of a wider pattern, part of the story of empire. So reading, I mean, I'm sure we could both, if we had a lot more time, tell anecdotes about this kind of thing, but there really weren't a lot of people talking about that in Scotland in terms of the Gaelic experience. But this writer that I came across who was doing that was this guy named John McInnes. And of anybody that I read, he was the person who seemed to have kind of his values were resonating and aligned with mine. And the thing that's so amazing about small countries like Scotland is that you can be interested in something and find that person and meet them and have start a friendship with them. And so that was, a really remarkable thing, that within a couple of years of arriving in Scotland, that I could immerse myself and like meet some of the very top scholars, sometimes accidentally by sitting at lunch with them and not knowing that I should be more, admire them more than I realized I should. But John McInnes, I was reading what he was writing, and I realized what an important intellect he was. And so, I really had a great privilege in spending so much time with John and being able to, absorb things about him and from him. And, I think that one of the things that I've tried to do is not just make it an intellectual exercise and, linguistics or in, I don't know, scale typology or something like that. Like, I'm really interested in psychodynamics, like what makes people tick, and how does the personal at the micro level reflect the macro level, the social level. And, the questions of empire and coloniality are very much kind of wrapped up in these kinds of questions that people's personal lives are guided by narratives or informed by narratives that are, very large scale narratives. And of course, in the Gaelic world, this is very complicated because, as John would say, people they have a great deal of cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, Gaels are celebrated for being these great warriors and champions of empire when they're out in the front lines. And yet, at home, you've got problems like massive drug and alcohol addiction and this kind of self-loathing that you see so often amongst Scots. So I found that to be a really interesting and kind of point of significance. Like, that's telling you something, that something interesting is going on that needs to be examined. And of course, those are also really sensitive and difficult things.
How did it feel? You kind of touched on it, but how did it feel to not only meet John McInnes, someone that you came to deeply respect and form a great friendship with, but to also form a friendship and then to publish some of his significant work? What was that like?
Well, of course, it was a great honor to be able to do that, but John was not the easiest person to work with. It has to be said. I think, John was so bright, and he had such broad interests that he just got bored immediately with anything after he wrote it. So it was very hard to get him to look at what I had done, because I didn't just take his texts immediately as they were. I tried to, well, of course, add annotations, endnotes or footnotes of his sources, because he often didn't do that. He'd just say, oh, from oral tradition. Well, you've got to do a little bit better than that if you want to make a book out of it. And then there were also things that, he'd have references to the event in which he gave a talk or something like that I thought could be taken out. And I also added certain bits of information, but getting him to read what he had written years previous was, not an easy task. So there was that. And well, John would be easily distracted. I don't know if he would be labeled as ADD or ADHD nowadays, but he was a bit like that. He, especially if we were socializing in a social environment like the pub, it was very hard to keep him on a single topic, especially if there was other conversations with people to be had.
So
just so maybe go down a little bit further, which is to say, I felt I like using the term born again Gael of myself, because for me, this was kind of a second birthing, a second kind of family that I felt, kind of adopted me, and that I felt that I wanted to adopt, because, John didn't have his children around at the time that I was around him. And we did spend a lot of time together and got very close. And that was true of other people as well. I spent a lot of time doing field work. I spent a lot of time with other, I really tried to have as immersive an experience as possible. And I didn't, as much as I like you and some of the other people who were North Americans, like my goal was to really be amongst other Gaels as much as possible. And so to me, it was, this immersive experience where I tried to absorb as much as I could. And one thing that I saw was that there is a Gaelic story and there's a Gaelic experience, and there were all of these voices that were not being heard. And I felt like, because I like to write, and that's something that that I was working on and that I still work on, that I think I have, some ability to do, to distill things and then to express them in a way that's accessible in a larger framework, that was going to be kind of my mission. And I did not have any concrete or practical plans about how I was going to make that work, because it does not work financially. But I felt like that's something that I could do to pay back the kindness and the generosity of people that I had while I was there, these people that I felt were kind of like my new adopted family.
And from my memory, Michael, you didn't just go out to the real Gaelic strongholds like the Western Isles and so on. You went to Eastern Highlands as well and places like that. Why was that important to you? It would have been so much easier to go, there's a plethora of people you can talk to. Why was that an important side trip for you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I had a real attachment to Perthshire. And I have a friend, James McDonald Reed, who kind of first introduced me to Perthshire, and I do have ancestry from Perthshire, from around Loch Rannoch side. So, as great as the communities are in the Western Isles, I also find it's a bit barren looking, and I find the mountains and the trees and the kind of the flora and fauna of the Central Highlands to be very, very appealing. And the fact that Gaelic I just missed, I think, the last generation of Gaelic speakers there. And I felt, especially because, people nowadays will say, oh no, Gaelic was never spoken here. It was never spoken on Loch Lomond side. It was never spoken in, in central Scotland. I mean, that just shows how quickly people erase and sponge out, or expunge the memory of Gaelic. So to me, it was also a really important marker to place on the map to say, look, Gaelic was spoken here within living memory, and there's this huge, rich tradition. And, while, of course, the Western Isles are an important stronghold of Gaelic, it kind of overemphasizes the remoteness of Gaelic to say, oh, you have to go to the Western Isles to get that. that language belongs the way out there. That's just not true. In fact, in recent years, like Bricker Lowry found somebody on Loch Lomond side who still spoke some Gaelic. And I found an elderly man who knew some Gaelic place names on Loch Lomond side that had not been recorded before. So I recorded those and took them to the place name project at the School of Scottish Studies. So, I think that there's a need for resources that show just the general public, as well as people that are learning Gaelic in schools, that this is something that is actually part of their neighborhood. It's not just something that belongs to remote parts of Scotland.
Yes, Gaelic was never spoken here, writes Ian MacDonald from Dunkeld. Yeah, that's a common one you hear, unfortunately. So you dove in, you wrote, talking to people, recording, writing, and eventually you were awarded a PhD. What happened next? You put Gaelic really at the center of your life for that whole period. You now freshly minted with a PhD. How easy was it to keep Gaelic in that center from that point on? And what impact has that had on you, that effort to keep it there?
Well, yeah, I certainly have done my best to keep it an active part of my life, but it's, it has been really difficult. It's been a real struggle sometimes. What I did immediately afterwards, because I had no money left and I didn't see any kind of practical plan to stay in Scotland, even though I kind of by default I wanted to be kind of a cultural activist and somebody who would generate resources. Now there's a lot more of that happening now in Scotland, but you'll recall 20 odd years ago when we left our PhDs, there was virtually nothing. And so I went back to the States and I thought I'll go somewhere where there's, some connection to Celtic studies. So I went to Boston and I worked in the library at Harvard for a year, earning almost nothing, so that I could have access to the library because I have amazing collections there, especially because of Charles Dunn. And so I wrote a couple of books during that year and a half that I was in Boston. And I picked up a lot more scholarly, intellectual tools from just going to lectures and seminars at the Celtic department there at Harvard. So that was pretty helpful in terms of just continuing my studies. And I went to Cape Breton once and visited, and but it was a real struggle. And certainly, what you hear from people, as an anecdote in Scotland, people in Scotland will kind of have this very negative attitude about Gaelic. Why are you learning Gaelic? Like, what use is that going to be of you?
What did your own family say, Michael? I'm curious about that.
They were probably just kind of happy to see me do what I wanted, but I was in Scotland for 7 years, so it was a bit difficult in terms of, I was away from my family, and that definitely did cause some strains, and I could only come back once a year at most. But I think they were kind of, a little bit befuddled, like why I would do it, but I didn't have a negative attitude about it. It was more like practically like, okay, are you going to be able to make a career of this? And of course, I didn't really know. But the funny thing, of course, in Scotland is that not only do they have this kind of negative attitude about Gaelic and things related to Gaelic, but they have the kind of this automatic deference to being an American and being from California. They think that, other people, Americans, whatever, have these silly myths about Scotland that they must believe in. And yet they have these silly myths that they believe about California. Like, I must know Madonna, I must be rich, I must live at the beach. And, my own personal life was completely the opposite of that. I grew up very poor, in the middle of the desert, I did actually go to high school with somebody who is now a celebrity, but that's a very odd fluke. So, it's, everybody kind of has their own myths, but they're not necessarily aware of it. And the myths that people have in Scotland are very detrimental to the, to the elevation, to the nourishment, to the nurturing of their own culture, because of this kind of deference, to the Anglo world and to the kind of myths about their own inferiority.
Is there one myth in particular that would stand out that you think is a an obstacle, and that would apply probably to us in Nova Scotia as well, to our Gaelic community? Anything particular stood out for you that surprised you, perhaps? Well,
just the degree in Britain to which the idea of modernity is equated with the Anglophone world. It's kind of hard to get to wrap your head around, because it's enjoyed such an exclusive hold on people's imaginations for so long. Like, there's only one proper language, only one language of progress, only one culture of progress. These kinds of things. So, I feel like coming from North America, and especially coming from an area, I grew up in an area where there was two languages spoken. I kind of felt like I was in between two communities. I didn't really belong to either one. I was passively capable in Spanish when I was growing up, but I didn't feel like I was like so you're either Hispanic or you're Anglo. So it's interesting, where I grew up in basically west of Texas, Anglo equals white. So that tells you something about, who the dominant, assimilative cultural group is. The dominant group is, modeled on the Anglo-Saxons. So in any case, I kind of felt I was in between different communities. And I think that kind of helped me when I went to Scotland, because I wasn't totally invested in this idea of being an Anglo. I was, much more open to the idea of multilingualism and multiculturalism and kind of the equality of different kinds of identities and cultures. And I think that's a problem in the UK, that, the idea of the Anglo-centric, Anglo-normative naturalness of that domination.
Yeah.
It really damages people, I think, self-confidence in their own culture.
So you come back to the US, you spent some time in Harvard working kind of for pauper wages. Just maybe briefly, we're getting closer to the end here, but Michael, maybe briefly, just talk like, how did you get by? Like, how did you keep Gaelic in the center of your world there, or try to, and what was the impact on you?
Well, I mean, one thing that I did was I went back to Scotland as much as I could. I would try to go back every summer. And I've had, various book projects. I was 5 years at St. FX, and that was, that had I not done that, it would have been a lot harder. My Gaelic was starting to wane. And this is, of course, in the days before Zoom and these kind of online tools, because nowadays I'll pop on Zoom and I'll talk to friends in Scotland now and again. But certainly, I mean, it really has been a challenge because, again, there's just hardly any support for what we're trying to do. You think like books, for example, I feel like writing books and gathering the information and trying to make it accessible to people is like my contribution to the Gaelic world. But if I spend, hundreds of hours writing a book, which is normal, and you think about, a couple of $1,000s of royalties for writing a book, that means, I earn $3 or $4 an hour at best for the work that I do. That means I have to make up for that in the rest of my life. So I have to have worked very hard at something else like IT to make up for the time that I've spent writing books. And this is why, scholarly books are generally written by people who have tenure in universities, because it doesn't matter to them what they earn. So, that was very difficult. Like I said, I came back to the States, was at Harvard working for, I could only work 17 hours a week because if I worked more, they'd have to give me benefits, so I was years and years without any health insurance. I was well in my 30s before I had health insurance. So, now nobody's made me do this. I haven't been forced. This is my own choice. I could have let go of this stuff years ago. And I sometimes think about conversation I had with Jonathan Dembling a while ago, where he said he realized, it was much smarter. He's a smarter guy than I am, to have some kind of practical skill and be around Gaelic communities rather than invest your time in an academic career that doesn't have any support. So, the sad thing is that Gaelic is this beautiful, rich universe. And this universe does not exist in a vacuum. You need a human container. You need a social container to keep it going, to keep it alive, to give it purpose and to give it structure and to give it meaning. And because the Gaelic communities in Nova Scotia, elsewhere in Canada, in Scotland, have been so marginalized and so fragmented by these, Anglo-centric imperial forces for so long, people's resistance is very worn down to that. So
I'm just thinking about you as well, Michael. I mean, that's a hard slog. You've got a PhD from one of the leading universities in the world. You're a distinguished scholar, very respected and very productive. And your life around Gaelic is, trying to make ends meet, doing IT when you can, the odd job like that. That's a pretty tough path to be on. So the last question I'd like to ask you, we have just a couple more minutes left here, is does Gaelic still matter to Michael Newton?
Well, I think it really does matter to me. It, again, kind of helps me feel like there is something real in the world that's rooted, that has social and cultural meaning and depth to it, more so than Disneyland. And now I have a daughter who's 10 years old. I've spoken Gaelic exclusively to her since she was born, and she went with me to Scotland this last summer, and it really deepened her own interest in Gaelic and made it, so much more real and intangible to her. And she got to meet lots of interesting personalities like Rudy MacEachen and John Purser and people like that, who I think she'll have memories for her whole life from this trip, because it was just so out of the ordinary for her, and it made Gaelic real. This is the first time she's spoken to children her own age in Gaelic, and she did perfectly well. She was as fluent as they were.
And what has that done with your relationship with Roisin?
Oh, it definitely means we have something very special between the two of us. And she can see that Gaelic is something special that she can share with other people, that, you know, it may be a minoritized language, but there are people that are passionate about it who will welcome her into their homes and will share things with her that she's never going to find anywhere around here.
Well, that's a lovely gift to have from all those years of effort, enriching your own life, enriching our lives with your scholarship, and then forming that great relationship with your daughter. And by the way, you've doubled the population of Gaelic speakers in your family, so congratulations there as well. Well. All right, Tafalet Gimo Vehicle. That was a very, very enjoyable excursion down the, very brief, unfortunately, but very enjoyable excursion down that path less taken with you. So what we're going to do now, folks, is we're going to go into our second breakout group. So we'll be doing something very similar. We'll be trying to get into groups of 3. The difference this time is you'll have about 20 minutes. So each person will have about 7 minutes to share their thoughts. And what we again encourage you to do is each take a turn, just listen and let them share what they're thinking. And then you can offer a gift if you like. You could say if there was anything particular that moved you and what they had to say about the question we're going to pose to you or Michael's talk. Again, we'll give you a notice to come back to the main hall. So we're going to put these kind of suggested questions up in the chat. We just changed them, so hopefully Susan has the new one up. But one simple one is just, did anything particularly stand out for you about Michael's journey? And then another one is what challenges do you face in your own Gaelic journey, and what opportunities have you seen emerge that you're excited about? And we'll leave it at that. So those should go up in the chat room. We'll see you in the chat or in the breakouts, and we'll be back here in 20 minutes. Patience with
This
very
meeting is
interesting
being
people
recorded.
in your breakout groups. What we're going to ask you to do now is we're going to open up the chat box there for you, and we'd like you to share your reflections of what went on in your chats. So where did your conversations go? Any new curiosities or questions that came up for you? Is there any action that you might be inspired to take as a result of what you heard from Michael tonight and the talks you had? So we'll give you about 5 minutes there to start posting up your thoughts as they come.
In the meantime, I would be very remiss not to acknowledge and to thank the many people who have been so supportive, because I don't want to just sound like I'm just whining about how difficult things have been. I mean, I've been really lucky to have so many wonderful friendships and supporters and people going out of their way to help me, help me pick up what I've picked up and to do what I've done.
Thanks, Michael. So a few comments here. We spoke of Gaelic songs holding a special quality, also the welcoming nature of the Gaelic community. These conversations made me so grateful to connect with others. It can feel isolating having so few ways to connect with others on my journey of learning Gaelic and deepening into that part of the Gaelic community. Talked about a beautiful spirit of generosity and gratitude that we see in the Nova Scotia Gaelic community, one that values elders and youngers, native speakers and learners, one that is curious and values all who are interested in Gaelic. I loved hearing about adopting and being adopted. I've experienced that too. I think the born again Gael sentiment has came up several times, certainly did in our group as well. We've talked about our paths to learning Gaelic in North America, the lack of resources for Celtic studies in academia. Marianne nailed it when she spoke of the dedication and sacrifice that developed into Michael's books. And yes, we're very thankful for that. I know I certainly am. I'm so thankful to have found so many great people and wonderful resources in my very, very short journey. I enjoyed Michael's story and perspective. Thank you so much. It was encouraging for my personal journey into the language and culture. Our breakout sessions talked a lot about music and song and the rhythm of the language and how the song might help the learner. Michael was amazing, the degree of commitment that he has made to the Gaelic world, and inspiring as well. I really resonate with Michael's description of being kind of gripped by the language and culture and respect him going with it. I'm grateful he did.
It is a bit like a virus.
We spoke of how Gaelic opened a door into a world that felt right. Here's a good one. Be persistent. Never be discouraged if the Gaelic isn't perfect, and just keep on going. There are a lot of good people out there who are willing to help with the learning process. I met two amazing people from Cape Breton. They shared some great resources. Really appreciate Michael talking about the justice aspect of learning Gaelic. So impressed by Michael's amazing perseverance and productivity in all he has given the community. Feeling a lot of gratitude for the opportunities that were created in the 80s and 90s that I benefit from as a child in music and language acquisition. Also for the opportunities and warmest welcomes I received from the community in Nova Scotia. I had an amazing group. One was Hannah, who I happen to know myself, who I've had as a teacher. I hold her in deep respect. I also had a person from Glasgow. We spoke of a number of things, but it's bringing dialects back. So amazing. So nice to hear that people are inspired and finding people that are wonderful resources for them. So I think we'll turn this over now to Francis. You can please carry on and put in any thoughts that come to mind. And Francis is going to talk about next week's session.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and thanks the wonderful comments that we collect and we put on the website, the How We Thrive website, and as well as the video. So be sure and check that out if you haven't seen the whole session, or if you want to look at other sessions. But I'm here to tell you what we're going to do next week. And one thing we did last summer is we took some of our Ed Haley sessions out into the community. And in fact, Michael Newton, when he was in Nova Scotia, did some sessions for us on some of reauthoring some Gaelic stories. So there's information on the website about that too. And we also visited with our Mi'kmaq neighbors in Waikoma. I'm just going to share the screen here to see some photos of our session that we had in Waikoma. And we went to the Sky River Trail and learned a lot more about Mi'kmaq traditions and their connection with this beautiful part of their community. And we shared some of our culture, and so it was a wonderful afternoon. So what we're going to do next week is invite 3 women that are involved in the Sky River Trail back, and they're going to talk about their language, the importance of their language, the importance of their traditions. And sometimes it's important to look at other cultures and see the similarities and see what we share in common in our shared love of our language and traditions. So next week, we'll be checking in with Ella, Nicholas, Eva, Nicholas and Susan Copage. So we hope you'll join us for that same time here on Zoom next week.
Great. Thank you, Francis. So it's just up to me now to thank everybody. I want to thank Gaelic Affairs and How We Thrive for helping us put these sessions together. My colleagues here at the Gaelic Narrative Project, that part of the team that kind of cooks this meal up for us. And especially a big thank you to Michael Newton and to all of you who make this such a wonderful gathering. We're going to put a link up in the chat box to Michael's Hidden Glen School, where you can learn about some of his teaching offerings and maybe how you can get your hands on books like this, Into the Fairy Hill. And on that note, we're going to turn you over to Margie Beaton, and she's going to play a couple of fairy-related tunes to say goodnight for the evening. So, Bianach Leith.
Apalev Gamor.
That was King of the Fairies and the Fairy Dance. So thank you very much for that, Margie. Thank you, Violet.
Bianach Leith.
Ich Leif.
Apalev.
Bianach Leif Holidinia.
Dankjewel.
Dankjewel, lief.
Dankjewel. Bedankt.